Every HTML element has a display and visibility property. The display property is generally set to block, inline, or none. Block elements always sit on top of each other by default. Elements that have a block behavior by default are elements like div, p, and li. These elements always move down to a new line when they display. Inline elements are elements like span. They don't create more vertical space unless they're forced to. I'll show you an example of this in just a moment. Visibility, on the other hand, this is another property you'll come across quite often in web programming. The li elements we've been working with are visible by default, but let me show you what happens when you set visibility to hidden. Let's go back to using the nth child trick to manipulate some display and visibility properties of this third element that's in our list, the one that says blueprint. First, what I'm going to do is say display none to see what impact this has, and refresh the page, and you can see that that particular list item is just removed from the page. Not only does it not render, but there's also no space there to render it in. So both the content and the space it had reserved, the box had reserved, are both gone. And that's a little bit different than saying visibility hidden. In this case, the list item will not display, but the space is left behind for it to appear. Visibility hidden is quite often used in combination with JavaScript to make an element appear and then go away, but without impacting the layout of the page. It doesn't make the whole page bounce up and down because the space is still there to display it when it comes back on. Let's remove the nth child bit and turn our attention to all list items. What I'm going to say now is display, and you can see that I can choose from block and inline. I'm going to set the display inline and refresh the browser. And now all of our list items are back and displaying. And there's a couple things to notice. First of all, they didn't create themselves on new lines. In other words, they display inline and will stretch across the page until you run out of space, and then they'll bounce down to the next line. And let me go in and set the zoom out a little bit so this is a little easier to see. And of course, the second thing to notice is that the width setting is no longer in effect. We have some elements displaying that are obviously less than 150 pixels, and this is because you cannot set the width of an inline element. They're going to expand so that all their content fits inside, and the padding and the border, but that's it. If we wanted these elements to be inline but still have block characteristics, like being able to set the width, that's another display setting, which is inline block. So now we can have the width, and we can also have these list items arrange themselves horizontally as long as there is enough space to display them all on one line. And hopefully this gives you an idea of the flexibility you can achieve in your presentation just using CSS and markup. Before we leave this module, let's go ahead and complete what could be a top-level navigational widget. That is almost like a menu control that's sitting up here with all the different URLs to different areas inside of a web application or a website that I've built. There's just a few things that I want to clean up to make it look a little more like a menu and behave a little more like a menu. For instance, I like the black border on the bottom of these entries, but I don't like anymore the red border on the left-hand side of these entries. So let's get rid of that. And also, it's a little bit ugly to have both the black border on the bottom of a list item and also an underline under the hyperlink. That underline comes from the user agent style sheet. Most links are underlined by default. If I wanted to get rid of that, what I could say is that the anchor tags inside of a list item should have a text decoration of none, as opposed to underline, which would be the default for an anchor tag. Now, if this were really inside of a web page, there's a couple other structural changes I would probably make too. For instance, I wouldn't want all list items to display in this fashion. I'm probably targeting specific list items that have some navigational content, and that's why I'd probably use a class here to indicate something like this particular list is actually a menu. And then instead of selecting all unordered lists or UL tags, I can go out and say, I'm looking to modify things that have a class of menu, or list items inside of a thing that have a class of menu. And we could also do that here to say anchors inside of list items inside of a element with a class of menu. And while we're here, let's also change the color here just to be black, which should make it a little easier to see. And we could make this flush with the top and the left by getting rid of the margin, but we could also align everything that's inside of here to the center of the browser window using a text align. And finally, for one last effect, let's go in and select list items that the mouse is currently hovering over. This is one of those pseudo classes that I told you about in the first module. It's not a specific class name that you attach to an element. It's something that exists because of where the element is positioned or how the user is interacting with that element at any particular time. So when someone hovers the mouse over an element, what I'd like to do is set the background color to this color, and now I should be able to refresh, and you can see that we get a slight effect whenever the mouse moves over one of these entries. I will caution you that this particular CSS doesn't work in old versions of Internet Explorer. It does work in Internet Explorer 9, but if you need to make this same effect work in something like Internet Explorer 6, you'll probably need to fall back to JavaScript. In this module, we looked at the box model of CSS and HTML, and now we know every element is inside of a box. Using CSS, you can control the width of the box as well as the margin, padding, and border around all four sides. We've used some of the basics that we've learned about CSS so far to take a bulleted list and transform it into a navigational control that renders horizontally across the top of the browser window.